psychology, psychosomatic manifestations are read as pathology, blockage, inauthentic physical embodiments of the psyche. Psychosomatic pain is read as falsehood, as the mind fooling the body into believing that there is something there, some physical trauma causing physical pain, when in actuality no such organic basis exists for this belief. The pain is not real, it's just in your head. We women that experience the protracted afterlives of trauma through the psychosomatic are marked as malingerers, consciously or unconsciously complicit in the untruths we tell about our bodies. As I write these words, my own ugly truths form and clash in the recesses of my mind, write themselves onto my body psychosomatically. I strain here the hauntings of history and affect through the violent murmurs of the unspoken, against the pain pangs of visceral anxiety. I feel paralyzed. I wrote this passage winter quarter 2012 as the starting point of analysis for a final paper. During winter quarter, I began to write this passage as a last-ditch effort in desperation. At the time, I was firmly anchored in the realm of the affective, unable to translate what Raymond Williams might call the structure of feeling that was the intimate, personal, moving, escaping present-ness of my psychosomatic experience into the communicable social form that is language and expressed emotion. I wrote as a reaction, a tentative engagement with the affective that attempted to experiment with affect as both force and form, a speculative use of voice in that final paper. I once again begin here with the psychosomatic as my point of departure to reiterate the long engagement I've had these last few years with the afterlives and after effects of violence. I position the psychosomatic, clinically constructed as gendered and pathologized space, as my starting off point to accent what I see as my project here and beyond. In the process of becoming attuned to the potentialities of the psychosomatic and other devalued sites, I hope to propose one decolonial feminist intervention into a story of violence, silence, and historical trauma that has become too increasingly defined by models of disease. Ever since I can remember, I remember learning to translate for my mother. Not just translating from English to Khmer to English, but translations of medical diagnoses, or oftentimes the lack of medical diagnoses. In and out of medical appointments, long hours in waiting rooms because my mother did not have health insurance. Ever since I can remember, I remember my mother being in pain. I have grown up intimately aware of the specter of genocide. And although we were never privy to long oral histories regarding the Cambodian Holocaust growing up, my siblings and I walked with the ghosts of the genocide in our day-to-day interactions with our mother and her reoccurring psychosomatic trauma. We often fell in line with the frustrated Western doctors that attempted to convince my mother that her pain was not real. We often left these medical appointments angry and uncertain, wondering what more we could have done to banish these ghosts from the past. 20 years later, in my own small way, I understand my mother's pain. And 20 years later, I also understand that there was little we could have done as children to take away such entrenched haunting. Looking back now, however, at these experiences with the psychosomatic, I wonder how else I might read my mother's pain, still reoccurring 20 years later. In shifting from understanding the psychosomatic as pathology to reading the psychosomatic as a kind of memory archive, I use Stoller's reconceptualization of history in a minor key. Rather than recuperating new histories or reading against the grain, listening to the psychosomatic as a kind of minor history means listening closely to the fragments already there. What might this mean, my mother's trauma reoccurring in bodily form for over 3 decades? What might the psychosomatic have to say about the ways in which my mother registered the violence of genocide? How might the psychosomatic function as a kind of affective remnant, remainders and reminders of unreconciled historical trauma? As affective archive, the psychosomatic functions much like what Raymond Williams terms a structure of feeling. Although manifested onto the body in a sensory register in line with Musavi's notion of the autonomy of affect, the psychosomatic evades semantic capture. Psychosomatic anxieties and the corporally registered pains evade simplistic constructions of meaning. Instead, they function as a kind of affective linkage of past to present and as both starting point and conclusion in their oftentimes frequently reoccurring nature. In its relationship as affective bridge between past trauma and present-day life, the psychosomatic also functions much in the same way as Kathleen Stewart's notion of ordinary affects. For my mother, the pervasiveness of the psychosomatic, what becomes the ordinariness of its manifestations, can be read as simultaneously telling a story about the daily registerings of violence during the genocidal event, as well as a story regarding the continuation of felt violences here in the aftermath in the U.S. Viewing the psychosomatic in this way allows us to begin to understand the ways in which such affective spaces hold the potential to enable, as well as disable meanings and actions in our everyday. As we end the first part of our interview with my mother, my older sister and I watch as my mother closes her eyes and begins to tell the vision she sees. After telling us about the public execution she witnessed during the Cambodian genocide, my mother suddenly tells us that she sees the specter of the executed man in her mind's eye. We watch as she becomes haunted by this memory of the past. As witnesses to her mother's haunting, my sister and I became acutely attuned to the currency of the past in our lives. We are reminded that Western colonial notions of demarcated time, as well as philosophical theories of transcendental violence, do little to explain the lived realities of our experiences. For my mother, such notions cannot capture the experience of this fragmented apparition walking into her consciousness over 3 decades after her witnessing of his murder. Rather, my mother's haunting can only be understood through the registered affect and the singularity of experience. We can only make meaning of such hauntings through an understanding of the ways in which the violence of the past comes to take hold in the moving present, the everyday. In Life in Words, Lina explores the ways in which the violence of world-shattering events comes to fold itself into the fabric of everyday life. In her ethnography, Das turns her attention not only to the possibilities of phenomena, but also to the singularity of lives, drawing our attention to the significance of the concepts of voice and the everyday in our discussions of violence. Das's differentiation of voice from speech, and particularly voice from the frozen slide quality of narratives and stories regarding the event of violence, is one framework from which to view my mother's haunting, as well as its subsequent crossing over into my father's recollections, which I don't have time for here, so in the Q&A I can expand on that. In many ways, my mother's story of this execution becomes a kind of narrative, perhaps I would argue not frozen in time, but a kind of relational speech, a story meant to be shared in the construction of a collective memory of the genocidal event. What comes to designate my mother's relating of experience as voice, however, is the break that occurs during the interview process. In giving this narrative, my mother experiences a break. In the haunting that follows on the heels of the story of execution, my mother's narrative is simultaneously punctuated as well as interrupted. It is almost as if the latent, teeming, subcutaneous realm of the affective, the excess, what Musumi might call that which escapes, erupts at this moment explicitly into the everyday. Lina might say that at this moment, rather than a narration of experience, my mother comes to show the violence of the genocide, not only through her words, but through a relating outwards of her sensory and corporeal experience. I began the conclusion to my final paper, Winter Quarter, with these lyrics from the Tegan and Sarah song, Walking with a Ghost. Winter Quarter, I used these lyrics as a springboard in which to close because they were literally playing in my head all week as I somaticized my own anxieties and traumas and attempted to continue to write against the loud ding of my own psychosomatic affective register. These were also the lyrics playing in my head when I began to narrate my mother's story, her psychosomatic manifestations, and doctor's appointments and empty medical diagnoses today, even after her engagement in a breaking of silence. About a week ago, my mother had called me to tell me that she was lonely, and she had also called to tell me that she was fasting. Fasting for 48 hours for x-rays she was going to have done. She had discovered some new pain, some new physical pain, a pain that necessitated a bodily cause. I steeled myself against the tightening in my chest, fighting against all those ugly narratives that pathologized my mother's experience, and I did my best, my difficult best, to listen. Perhaps, I thought later, there was a kind of corporeal cause for my mother's physical pain, a different kind of bodily injury, a wounding that had imprinted itself in my mother's psychic register many years ago. After all, as I've been told in interpersonal correspondence, witnessing is a type of violence, a kind of human rights violation. Perhaps there is an element of physicality to witnessing death, I thought, as there is undoubtedly such an element in resisting the impending death of starvation. Even so, even with such an effort to begin to listen more closely to the space of in-betweenness that is the psychosomatic, I wrote fairly despairingly Winter Quarter. This is a trauma that simply cannot be reconciled with liberatory Western narratives of broken silence and empowerment. This year, my mother gave her story, her oral narrative of survival and trauma during the Cambodian genocide. I have also interwoven my own broken silence into the narratives of my father, my mother, and my grandmother, laying bare my own possible identity narrative of original injury. And yet, as is evident in my conversation with her last week, my mother still manifests her pain through these psychic corporeal channels, as do I. I ended my paper winter quarter on a similar, perhaps despairing note. Perhaps for now, it may be enough to simply learn to read and value fragmented rememory in all its forms, learning to piece together possible decolonial meanings out of the echoes of the devaluing. Perhaps for now, dare I say it, it is enough to just keep walking with the ghost. Here with you all, in the afterlife of that final paper, I would like to revisit the lyrics of this song as well as some of my concluding words. Instead of creating a counter-narrative to my possibly despondent series of conclusions, I would like to sit my words down with a few reflections from Lina concerning feminist methodologies, ethics, work on violence, and the everyday. This time around, as I sit with the lyrics to the song, not only do I hear the ghosts of the past embodied in the psychosomatic anxieties of the present, I hear Lina feminist approach to questions of violence and experience. I was walking with a ghost. I said, please, please don't insist. Das writes about her experience with one of her respondents. What I found compelling was her recognition that her violation was of an order that the whole principle of life stood violated, and that to put it back into words could not be done except with extreme hesitation. Hence the boundaries she had created between saying and showing could not be crossed by careless invitations to conversation such as, tell me what happened. Contrary to dominant Western models in which speech becomes empowerment, Das reminds us about the place of feminist ethics in any work on violence. She shows us so beautifully how words and the putting back into words may do its own violence rather than contribute to a space of healing. In this engagement with methodology and ethics, Das also offers up the realm of the ordinary and everyday as an alternative framework in which to engage notions of healing. Rather than search for some transcendental monolithic sense of recovery as healing, Das attunes us to the ways in which victims and survivors affirm the possibility of life by descent into the everyday. This redeeming of life through the act of attending to the ordinary reminds us of the ways in which healing from violence almost necessarily happens in process, just as the afterlives of violence embed themselves into the processes of the everyday. In this movement to redeem life, affective registers, especially in their ability to create movement, feeling the sense of being touched, construct possibilities for practices of healing. Just as the affective register of the psychosomatic has and continues to embed itself into my mother's as well as my own everyday, other affective registers of love and humility remind us that we are still here, living every day, working through and existing alongside the afterlives of violence. In ordinary affects, potentiality to create such turns as spaces of interconnectivity, I sense the possibility for an ongoing healing, a process by which fragments of violence become simultaneously enfolded into and then remedied by engagement with life in the everyday.